The clock on the car's dashboard read 10:03 a.m. as Thomas Bennett parked in front of the large mirrored building that housed the First National Bank. He took one last look at the folder of documents on the passenger seat, meticulously prepared over the past few weeks. Those papers represented years of hard work, building his construction company from the ground up. Today, more than ever, he needed that loan to expand his business and take advantage of the contract John Miller, one of the city's biggest real estate investors, had entrusted to him. Outside, the bank building was imposing, with wide columns and a modern facade reflecting the morning sunlight. Thomas took a deep breath before getting out of the car, feeling a wave of anxiety he couldn't control. This wasn't the first time he had requested a loan, but something about this visit made him uneasy. There was something in the air, a tension he could barely explain. Walking through the bank's lobby, with its gleaming marble floors and impeccably organized counters, Thomas felt small for a moment. He knew he belonged there, knew he had everything he needed, but the feeling of not fitting into that space nagged at him. His footsteps echoed softly as he approached the reception, where a young woman with a rehearsed smile quickly attended to him. "I have an appointment with Mr. Edward Wallace. My name is Thomas Bennett." She checked the system and nodded, leading him to the office of the credit manager. Thomas followed her down a wide hallway adorned with pictures of smiling men at corporate events and abstract artwork. It felt like a different world, and for a moment, he felt like an outsider. Entering Edward Wallace's office, Thomas was greeted with a cold, formal handshake. Edward, a man in his 50s with neatly combed gray hair and thin-framed glasses, settled into the leather chair behind the large darkwood desk. He motioned for Thomas to sit and then took the folder of documents he had brought. "So, Mr. Bennett, let's see what we have here," Edward said, opening the folder and beginning to examine the papers, his eyes quickly scanning through the numbers and contracts. Thomas watched the manager's every move, trying to read his reactions, but Edward was a hard man to decipher. As much as he tried to maintain his confidence, Thomas felt something was wrong. It wasn't just the formality of the environment. There was something in Edward's eyes, something that made him feel like he was being evaluated beyond the numbers. "Your business, Mr. Bennett," Edward began, lifting his eyes from the papers. "Is it entirely yours? Is it in your name?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, everything is here. I am the owner, and I've been expanding over the past few years. I already have signed contracts, including one with Mr. John Miller, one of the biggest investors in the city." Edward nodded slowly, but his expression didn't change. He flipped through the documents with an almost disinterested look. It seemed that, despite the evidence in front of him, he had already formed an opinion about Thomas and his capability. "I see," Edward murmured, still looking at the papers. "But I'm seeing a few, points that raise certain questions. You know, our bank needs solid guarantees, especially for a loan of this size." Thomas tried to remain calm. He knew the numbers made sense, and he had prepared for this. But with each vague response from Edward, the weight of frustration grew on his shoulders. The manager was clearly inventing problems. "What do you mean, Mr. Wallace? These contracts are strong and—" Edward interrupted, raising one hand. "Look, Mr. Bennett, what I'm saying is that, at this time, we cannot approve your request. There are inconsistencies in some areas that prevent us from proceeding with this operation." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. "Inconsistencies? What inconsistencies?" "All the documents are correct, I checked everything. The contract with Mr. Miller is solid. I have everything the bank asked for." Edward sighed, closing the folder slowly and deliberately. "I understand, but our bank must be extremely cautious with certain types of operations, and in this case, the risk is too great for us. I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett." It was a polite way of saying they simply didn't trust him. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, and he felt frustration building, but he knew arguing at that moment wouldn't help. He stood up slowly, clenching his jaw to hold back the response he wanted to give. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wallace," he said, with effort. As he left the office, Thomas was barely accompanied by a "thank you for your visit." Walking back down the hallway, he felt the eyes of the bank employees on him, as if they already knew the outcome of the conversation. When he finally stepped out the door, the warmth of the sun felt muted, almost stifling. He knew that rejection had nothing to do with his financial history or the business he had in hand. It was something deeper, something he had felt before. Back in the car, Thomas sat in silence for a moment, staring at the reflection of the mirrored building. He knew he couldn't give up, but a mix of frustration and injustice was growing inside him. He needed to talk to Angela, his wife, to find strength and decide what to do next. Thomas parked the car in front of his house, a small, cozy home in the suburbs. The modest garden at the entrance looked more neglected than usual. He noticed that, in the past few weeks, he hadn't had time to take care of the little things. His mind had been consumed by the contract with John Miller and the urgent need to expand his company. The frustration from what had happened at the bank still weighed on his shoulders. As he walked toward the door, Thomas tried to organize his thoughts. The last thing he wanted was for Angela to notice how much it had affected him, but deep down, he knew it would be impossible. When he entered, the familiar smell of dinner greeted him, and he saw Angela, his wife, stirring a pot in the kitchen. She always managed to make the atmosphere lighter with her presence. It was as if, when he crossed the door, part of his problems stayed outside. Angela turned as she heard the door close and, seeing the look on Thomas's face, immediately knew something was wrong. "How did it go at the bank?" she asked, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her tone was soft but full of concern. Thomas sighed, placing the folder of documents on the dining table. He walked over to her, kissed her on the forehead, and then sat heavily in a chair. For a few moments, he was silent, thinking about how to explain what had happened without revealing all the frustration he felt. "It didn't go well, Angela," he began, rubbing his face with his hands. "They denied the loan. They said the risks were too high, that there were inconsistencies in my documents, but you know as well as I do that everything is right. Everything I showed them is in order." Angela sat beside him, holding his hands. "You know what it was, don't you?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Thomas looked into her eyes and saw understanding there. He knew he wouldn't have to explain what he was feeling, Angela already understood. "It was prejudice, Angela," he said, his voice lower. "They treated me like I didn't even have the right to be there, like it was impossible for me to own a business. The manager, Edward. He looked at me as if I were an intruder, someone trying to cheat the system." Angela squeezed his hands tightly, her face reflecting a mix of indignation and support. She had always been the one to keep him steady, even in the worst storms. While Thomas had tried to maintain his dignity at the bank, it was beside her that he allowed himself to be vulnerable. "Thomas, you've worked so hard to get to where you are. You can't let this bring you down. They don't know what you've built, but I do. I saw every sacrifice you made, every hour of work. You own one of the most respected companies by those who have hired you. It's not the opinion of a man like Edward Wallace that will define who you are." He looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. He knew she was right, but the humiliation of being treated that way still stung deeply. However, there was no option but to keep going. "And now? What are we going to do?" Thomas asked, trying to find a path forward. Angela, with her usual wisdom, smiled slightly. "You're going to talk to John Miller," she suggested. "You have a contract with him, Thomas. He trusts you and your work. John needs to know what's going on. Maybe he can help you in some way, or even speak to the bank. After all, he's a partner there, isn't he?" The idea of telling John what had happened made Thomas uncomfortable. He didn't want to seem incapable or give the impression that he was asking for help with something that should have been resolved on his own. It was his business, his problem, after all. But Angela was right. If he couldn't be honest with John, then who could he be honest with? "I don't know," Thomas began to say, but Angela interrupted him with a firm look. "You're not asking for charity, Thomas. John Miller trusts you. He's a fair businessman, and if he knows what happened, maybe he can step in and fix this. You can't let that manager's prejudice stop you from growing." Thomas knew Angela was right. The contract with John Miller was a big opportunity, and he couldn't let a hurdle like that bank stop him from moving forward. Still, the thought of admitting to John that he hadn't secured the financing bothered him. "All right, I'll talk to him," Thomas finally said. "But it's hard. I didn't want him to know I couldn't solve this on my own. It feels like I'm failing." Angela stood up, placing her hands on Thomas's shoulders. "You're not failing. You're being honest. And if there's anyone who understands the difficulties of rising in a system that constantly tries to push you down, it's John. He started from the bottom, remember? He'll understand." Thomas nodded, a little more encouraged, but still nervous about the idea. Deep down, he knew she was right, as always. He needed to go to John and tell the truth, even if it meant exposing his vulnerability. That night, as he prepared for bed, Thomas reflected on what Angela had said. Fighting prejudice wasn't new in his life, but each battle left its mark. And now, more than ever, he needed to win this fight, not just for himself, but for his company, his legacy, and for Angela, who had always believed in him. The next morning, Thomas had already decided he would go to John and be honest. He would tell him what had happened at the bank, even at the risk of appearing incapable. He just hoped that the trust John had in him wouldn't be shaken by this. As he closed his eyes to sleep, Thomas knew that the next day would be crucial. The next day, Thomas prepared with a mix of anxiety and determination. He had spent the morning organizing his schedule, but the weight of the meeting with John Miller was heavy on his mind. Going to John to tell him he hadn't secured the financing felt like a confession of failure, but he knew he had no other choice. The contract with John was the biggest opportunity for his company, and he needed to be honest, even if it meant exposing his vulnerability. John Miller's office, located in a luxurious office building in the heart of the city, reflected the man's influence and success. John was known for his ability to spot good deals and invest in high-value properties, transforming entire neighborhoods with his acquisitions. He was a man who had started from nothing, and that was one of the reasons he and Thomas got along so well. They both knew what it was like to build something with their own hands. When Thomas arrived at the building, the doorman recognized him immediately and greeted him with a respectful smile. Everyone knew who he was, thanks to the various contracts he had already secured with John. Riding the elevator to the top-floor office, Thomas felt tense, but the comforting presence of Angela in his mind kept him calm. "You're being honest," he repeated to himself like a mantra. Upon arriving at the reception, John's assistant led him to the conference room, where John was already waiting. In his 50s, with gray hair and a confident demeanor, John Miller always exuded a sense of absolute control. He stood up as soon as he saw Thomas enter and greeted him warmly. "Thomas. How are you? Please, sit down. I'm eager to hear how the preparations are going." Thomas forced a smile as he sat down. He felt the weight of the moment and realized he couldn't delay the issue. "John, I need to be honest with you. I had a problem at the bank yesterday. I went to request a loan to buy the machinery we need to complete the contract we signed, but they denied my request." The words came out heavier than he had imagined. John raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised. "They denied it? What do you mean they denied it?" He crossed his arms and leaned forward in his chair. "You have everything you need. I entrusted this contract to you myself. Your numbers are solid, it doesn't make sense. What bank are we talking about?" Thomas took a deep breath and mentioned the name of the bank, along with the manager who had handled his case. Upon hearing this, John fell silent for a few moments, making Thomas feel even more uncomfortable. But what came next took him by surprise. "You're saying it was First National?" John asked, now in a more serious tone. "That doesn't make any sense. I'm a partner in that bank. How could they deny your loan, especially knowing it's for a contract that involves me directly?" Thomas blinked, surprised. "You're a partner." He had no idea John was such an influential figure within the institution. John shook his head, clearly outraged by the situation. "This is unacceptable. If they're denying a loan with a contract that has my signature behind it, something is very wrong." He paused, thoughtful, before continuing. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to go back to the bank tomorrow and act as if nothing happened. Reapply for the loan, as if it's the first time. And I'll be nearby, watching. Let's see how they handle it when they realize they can't treat you this way." Thomas felt a mix of relief and nervousness. He knew John's presence would change the dynamic completely, but he was also apprehensive about the reaction of the bank's employees. However, he trusted John. If anyone could make a difference at that moment, it was him. "I didn't want to seem weak, John, which is why I didn't talk to you before. I wanted to handle this on my own, but..." Thomas began to say, but John interrupted him. "Thomas, this isn't about being weak. It's about being treated fairly. You didn't ask for anything unreasonable. They treated you in a way they should never have. This needs to be corrected, and I'll make sure it is." Thomas nodded, feeling a little more confident. There was something reassuring about the way John spoke, a certainty that the world should work fairly and justly, and that any deviation would be rectified with his intervention. Before they parted, John looked him directly in the eyes and said, "I trust your work, Thomas. And I'll make sure they trust it too. Don't worry, this will be resolved." As he left John's office, Thomas felt a different weight on his chest. He knew the next day would be crucial, but now, with John's support, he had a real chance of making things happen. The next morning, Thomas woke up earlier than usual. There was something different about that day. Although he still felt the tension in his stomach, he knew that John Miller's presence would bring an undeniable advantage. He wasn't alone anymore. He repeated Angela's words in his mind, "You're being honest." Even so, the nervousness was palpable. Returning to the same bank, to be served by the same employees, brought an uncomfortable feeling of déjà vu. When he parked the car in front of the First National Bank, Thomas took a deep breath and looked at the building again. This time, he tried to mentally prepare for what he knew would be an emotional battle. He entered the bank with firm steps, but his eyes caught the same tellers as before. Their whispers began as soon as they saw him walk through the door. "Him again," whispered one of the tellers. "Yeah, I guess he still hasn't gotten the message," said another, as discreet glances and muffled laughter emerged. Thomas ignored the looks, walking up to Edward Wallace's desk, the credit manager who had denied the loan the day before. Edward recognized him immediately, and a forced smile appeared on his lips. A smile Thomas knew well, the kind that didn't hide the disdain behind the polite facade. "Ah, Mr. Bennett, back so soon," Edward said, adjusting his glasses with a meticulous gesture. "What can I do for you today?" Thomas felt the tension growing inside him but decided to keep his composure, remembering John's and Angela's words. He handed over the same documents and calmly said, "I'm here to reapply for my loan." Edward took the papers, but his disinterested look was clear. He began flipping through the documents exactly as he had done the day before, with no sense of urgency. The atmosphere in the office felt colder and more hostile, with other employees watching from a distance, as if they expected the same rejection. Thomas remained silent, observing the manager's actions. He knew the result would likely be the same, but something inside him was stronger now. He was no longer willing to be treated like an outsider. After a few minutes of silence, Edward sighed, closing the folder with a quick motion. "Well, Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry, but as I explained before, there are certain..." He hesitated, searching for vague words. "Inconsistencies that prevent us from approving your loan request." Thomas knew those words were coming. He had been expecting them. But this time, something inside him broke. He was no longer going to accept the way he was being treated. "Inconsistencies," he said, his voice now firmer, no longer trying to hide his indignation. "Explain to me what these inconsistencies are. All the documents are correct. The contract I presented is solid, and you're just making up excuses to deny my request. You're denying me this loan because of the color of my skin." The office fell silent. The glances from the employees, once amused, now turned curious, and some shrank at the word prejudice. Edward, for his part, seemed to lose his composure for a moment. He hadn't expected such a direct accusation. "Mr. Bennett, I don't know what you're talking about. We follow strict banking policies here." "The bank does not," Edward began to say, but his voice was trembling, and he was clearly struggling to maintain control. At that moment, the bank's doors opened, and the imposing figure of John Miller walked through the lobby. John wasn't alone. The regional director of the bank, Robert Hargrove, was also with him, both walking with serious and determined expressions. The atmosphere in the bank changed instantly. John wasted no time. He walked directly to Thomas, ignoring the looks from the employees, and with a warm smile, shook Thomas's hand firmly and amicably. "Thomas. Good to see you. So, how are things going?" John asked casually, but there was something in his tone that made it clear he knew exactly what was going on. Edward froze for a moment, not knowing how to react. He seemed to be stuck in place, trying to understand what was happening. All eyes in the bank were on that interaction. Thomas, trying to remain calm, replied in an equally calm tone. "Well, John, it seems I'm having some problems getting the loan I need. Mr. Wallace here informed me that there are inconsistencies in my documents." John looked at Edward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Inconsistencies? That's very interesting, considering the contract for which Thomas is requesting the loan was signed with me. Is the bank refusing to finance something that directly involves one of the city's biggest investors?" John said, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. Edward's face turned red, and he began to stammer a response, but John cut him off. "Let me explain something, Mr. Wallace," John began, his tone now more severe. "Thomas Bennett is a trustworthy businessman with an impeccable track record. What you're doing here is not just poor customer service, it's discrimination. And I will not tolerate that at a bank where I'm a partner." The impact of John's words was devastating. Edward tried to maintain his composure, but there was no longer any way to hide what was happening. John turned to the regional director, Robert Hargrove, who had been watching everything in silence. "Robert, I need you to resolve this immediately. I want this loan application approved today. And after that, we'll have a serious conversation about this bank's policies," John said, firmly. Robert nodded, trying to appear calm but clearly shaken by the public scene. He ordered a new manager to take over Thomas's case immediately. Edward, for his part, stood frozen, knowing his position at the bank was hanging by a thread. The new manager, a professional and courteous woman, took over the approval process, and Thomas, relieved, began to see the situation resolve itself. But something inside him still burned. The way he had been treated couldn't be ignored. He knew John was by his side, but that experience had left scars. While Thomas, now accompanied by a new manager, completed the loan process downstairs, a very different atmosphere was forming in the bank's second-floor meeting room. The tension was palpable. John Miller and the regional director, Robert Hargrove, stood in front of the conference table, while Edward Wallace, still pale from the public confrontation, remained silent, sitting in the corner of the room with his eyes fixed on the floor. John, who had always maintained a calm and composed demeanor, now wore a sharp look. He began pacing back and forth, clearly irritated. "What happened here is a disgrace to this institution, Robert," John began, without mincing words. "Thomas Bennett is one of the most competent businessmen I've worked with. And here we are, with him having to deal with your manager trying to make him feel unworthy of credit. I won't accept this." Robert, who had remained silent until that moment, sighed deeply. He knew John was right. This wasn't just an uncomfortable situation with a customer, it was something much deeper. The clear discrimination and prejudice treatment could tarnish the bank's reputation. And with a partner like John, the situation became unsustainable. "John, you know this doesn't reflect the bank as a whole," Robert tried to argue, but his voice sounded less confident than he would have liked. "I understand that there was a mistake here, and we will take the necessary steps." John stopped pacing and turned directly to Edward, who still hadn't lifted his head. "Necessary steps?" John repeated, almost accusingly. "We're talking about more than just a mistake, Robert. We're talking about institutional racism. Your manager, Edward, was clearly determined to deny Thomas's loan from the start. He didn't evaluate the documents fairly. He decided that Thomas, because he's a black man, didn't belong here. This isn't just poor judgment, it's unacceptable conduct. Edward finally lifted his head, his expression a mix of desperation and denial. Mr. Miller, He began to speak, but his voice trembled. I followed procedures. There was I didn't act out of prejudice. The bank's policies are clear, and John interrupted him, his voice laden with authority. Policies? What policies, Edward? The policies you claim to follow clearly don't apply to all customers. I can see what really happened here. You decided that Thomas wasn't creditworthy for a reason that has nothing to do with his ability to pay. And that's why I'm demanding your resignation. The room fell silent. The impact of John's words hung in the air. Robert looked at John, then at Edward, knowing there wasn't much to discuss. If he insisted on keeping Edward on the team, the bank wouldn't just lose John's respect, it would face an even bigger reputational crisis. John, I understand you're deeply upset, and I agree that action needs to be taken, Robert said cautiously. We'll begin the process of terminating Edward immediately. This will be done appropriately, but I assure you, he will be held accountable. Edward, visibly shocked, tried to argue one last time. Please, I have a family. That wasn't my intention. I followed procedures as I always do, he stammered, desperate. John, however, didn't relent. He walked over to Edward, now looking him directly in the eyes. You had the chance to do the right thing, Edward. The issue here isn't about you having a family, it's about the fact that you acted in a prejudiced and unjust manner. People like Thomas, who work hard every day, can't afford to be treated the way you treated them. Your resignation isn't a disproportionate punishment, it's simply what needs to be done. John turned to Robert. I expect this action to be swift, Robert. Because if something like this happens again at this bank, I'll be the first to ensure it makes headlines. There's no room for this kind of behavior in a place that carries my name. Robert nodded seriously. He knew John was right and that Edward's dismissal was the only solution to preserve the bank's reputation. Consider it done, John, Robert responded resolutely. After that brief but intense exchange of words, John turned to leave the room. Before leaving, he looked one last time at Edward, who now sat completely defeated. This wasn't just a moment of justice, but a lesson. John knew his influence could change the course of that bank, but he also knew that attitudes like Edward's were only a reflection of something deeper. He hoped that this action would serve as a warning to all other employees. Meanwhile, downstairs, Thomas felt a mix of relief and discomfort. While he was glad to finally get the loan, the fact that he had to rely on John's intervention to secure what was rightfully his still bothered him. The new manager who attended to him was much more efficient and courteous. In a few minutes, she finalized the entire process. As he left the bank, with the loan approved, Thomas felt the sun on his face in a way he hadn't the day before. There was a sense of victory, but also a deep understanding that the fight was far from over. He had achieved what he needed that day, but the prejudice he faced was bigger than a simple denied loan. Thomas knew he would have to keep fighting. But now, at least, he had renewed confidence that there were people by his side willing to fight for justice. After the intense meeting and Edward Wallace's dismissal, the atmosphere at the bank was still tense, but now there was a sense of change in the air. John Miller and Robert Hargrove headed to the boardroom, where they sat to discuss the next steps. The regional director knew he needed to act quickly to salvage the bank's reputation. John wouldn't let that incident go unnoticed, and now it was time to revamp some of the institution's practices. John, I want you to know that we are committed to making significant changes here. We'll review our credit policies and train employees so that cases like this don't happen again, Robert said, trying to demonstrate proactivity. John stared at him for a few seconds, weighing his words. That's a start, Robert. But it's important that the bank doesn't just implement internal changes. You need to be transparent with the public, show that you're truly committed to creating an inclusive environment for everyone. This can't be treated as an isolated incident, because we know it's not. Prejudice is ingrained in many institutions like this, and it needs to be fought clearly. Robert nodded, recognizing the gravity of the situation. I understand. I'll meet with the board today to discuss how we can reform our approach. Additionally, I think it's important to issue a public statement, showing that we're taking concrete actions to ensure that all our clients, regardless of their background, are treated with respect. John leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. That's the bare minimum. And remember, Robert, I'm not just concerned about the bank's reputation. I'm concerned about the impact situations like this have on people like Thomas Bennett. He shouldn't have gone through that. Neither he nor any other black or minority entrepreneur. A client's success shouldn't be blocked by petty prejudices. Robert didn't have much to say. He knew John's message was strong and true. Once again, he promised to do whatever it took to ensure that the bank was seen as a reliable and fair institution. The meeting ended with the sense that change was on the way, but John knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. Meanwhile, Thomas had returned to his company, finally with the financing in hand. The relief of securing the loan was undeniable, but he knew he couldn't relax. Now was the time to prepare for expansion and ensure his company was up to the challenge of the contract he had signed with John. Back in the office, he reviewed the financial documents once again and began organizing the steps for purchasing the new machinery. Every detail had to be perfect. He knew this opportunity was crucial for his business's growth, and failure was not an option. While working, the phone on his desk rang. It was Angela, his wife, wanting to know how the rest of the day at the bank had gone. Thomas took a deep breath before answering, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Hey, love. How are you? Angela's warm voice brought a sense of calm to Thomas, who, for a moment, put aside the accumulated exhaustion. I'm fine now. I finally got the loan, he replied, trying to keep his tone light. I knew you'd get it. I'm so proud of you. And what happened to the manager who treated you that way? Thomas hesitated for a moment, recalling the scene at the bank. He was fired. John made sure he was held accountable for what he did, he said, without going into too much detail. The subject still bothered him, and there was a bitterness he couldn't completely shake. Angela paused on the other end of the line, reflecting on the situation. It's good to know he was held accountable, but that doesn't change the fact that you had to go through that. Prejudice is everywhere, Thomas, and you know this won't be the last time you face something like this. What matters is that you remember who you are and everything you've accomplished. No one can take that away from you. Thomas smiled, even though he was tired. Angela always knew what to say. You're right. I know there will still be obstacles ahead, but at least now I have the chance to expand the business and show that I'm capable of going even further. Angela encouraged him to stay focused and determined. They talked for a few more minutes before Thomas hung up the phone, feeling a little lighter. Angela's words, as always, brought the perspective that, although the fight against prejudice was ongoing, he had taken an important step that day. The following days were intense. Thomas dedicated himself entirely to the expansion of his company, working day and night to ensure everything was in place to meet John Miller's contract. The team began training to handle the new demands, and the machinery was purchased and installed as planned. Despite the rush, the sense of accomplishment was growing. Thomas knew his company was about to take a significant leap, and that was a source of pride, both for him and Angela. But he also knew that this success wasn't just for him. He was creating a legacy, something that would prove that men like him, coming from where he came from, could overcome any obstacle. While Thomas worked, John Miller, true to his word, continued to closely monitor the implementation of changes at the bank. Edward's dismissal had sent a clear message, and corrective actions were being put in place. The bank was now under scrutiny, and John wanted to ensure there was no more room for discrimination or prejudice. Months had passed since the tumultuous day at First National Bank. Thomas Bennett's company was completely transformed. the expansion he had planned was complete, and the new machinery, along with the trained team, allowed him to increase production and deliver even higher quality work. Now, he was preparing for the most important moment, delivering the final project to John Miller, the man who, besides being a client, had become a key figure in his journey of overcoming. Thomas drove to the construction site of John's latest development. Upon arriving, he admired the large residential complex his company had helped build. It was a tangible proof of his ability, something that represented not just the success of a contract, but the triumph over the challenges life had thrown at him. At that moment, the sun shone on the building, as if illuminating his future path. John was waiting for him at the site, smiling as always, with his hands in the pockets of his linen pants. When Thomas got out of the car, John walked toward him, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Thomas, my friend, I knew you'd make it. This project is flawless." "I couldn't be more satisfied," said John, with sincere excitement in his tone. Thomas shook John's hand firmly, feeling a gratitude that went beyond a simple work contract. "I have to thank you, John. Without your help, without your support that day at the bank, none of this would have been possible. You were the one who opened this door for me." John shook his head, as if he didn't want to take all the credit. "You know, Thomas, I just did what any decent person would do. But it was you who did the hard work. You were the one who showed the value of your business and delivered something extraordinary." The two of them walked through the construction site, observing the final details of the project. John was visibly impressed, but he was also reflecting on everything that had happened since the incident at the bank. "The truth is, that day changed a lot for me too. Seeing how you were treated made me realize that we still have a long way to go," John said, with a more serious expression. "But what struck me the most was your resilience, Thomas. You didn't let that obstacle stop you, and that's why we're here today, celebrating your success. You're an inspiration." Thomas felt the weight of John's words. He knew his fight wasn't just for himself but for everyone who faced prejudice and discrimination. Every one of his achievements represented a victory against a system that often tried to bring him down. He smiled slightly, looking at the building his company had constructed. "There will always be challenges, but I think what's important is to keep fighting, no matter what." John nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Thomas's words. "And that fight, my friend, is what builds a legacy. It's not just about the success of a project or a company. It's about the impact you have on the people around you. You're creating something that goes far beyond bricks and concrete. You're creating an example for future generations." The silence between them was comforting, a moment of deep mutual understanding. Thomas knew that behind every battle won, there was a story of overcoming, and this was his. He had grown not only as a businessman but as a human being. The support of his wife Angela, the lessons learned over the years, and the determination not to let prejudice define him had shaped the man he was today. When they finished walking through the construction site, John turned to Thomas once again. "This is just the beginning, Thomas. I'm sure we'll work together on many more projects. Your talent and strength are undeniable. And now, the whole world can see that." Thomas smiled with a mix of pride and humility. He knew his path would still have obstacles, but he also knew that now, more than ever, he had the strength to face them. "Thank you, John. I know that with partners like you, I can go even further." With one last handshake, the two men said their goodbyes, aware that this meeting represented more than the completion of a project. It was the beginning of a new phase for Thomas, where his name, his company, and his story would echo as symbols of perseverance and success. As he drove back home, Thomas felt the cool breeze on his face and smiled. The future, now, seemed brighter than ever. When he arrived home, Angela was waiting for him with a smile. They embraced in silence, aware that this moment was a victory for both of them. It was proof that, even in the face of all adversity, together, they could overcome anything. Thomas Bennett's legacy was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.